Hello, I'm Diane from Millhouse Quilts. Today we're continuing our scrap series, and our topic today is odds and ends and fun stuff, which is sort of a generic thing for whatever we haven't talked about so far. The first one I have here is a challenge I set myself. I had finished this beautiful Asian quilt, and I had gorgeous scraps, and I said, okay, make yourself make something out of that. You are not allowed to put any other fabric in. You can only use what you had. So with that in mind, the pattern had a lot of the place where the gold was already sewed to the black, and so I had these strips. And I thought, all right, I will use that in segments. And then I made a whole bunch of half square triangles. So I had lots of the black left over, and I used assorted prints, and I made half square triangles with the black and the print, black and print. And I had, afterwards, I cut squares. I cut this to this size, and then I went through my scraps that were left and cut assorted solid squares, same size as my half square triangle. And basically what I did was make a 9-patch block. If you look at it as the corner, it's 1, 2, 3. It happens to be that I have pieced my 9-patch squares, but it's still a 9-patch because there's this section, and this section. It's 3 by 3. So 4 half square triangles and 4 of the rails and then 1 center. And I had a little bit of gold left over at the end, so I put in a folded flange. This is a fun little accent touch if you ever want to do it. You can see it's loose. It's just probably cut about 3/4 of an inch, ironed in half, wrong sides together, and then sewed on the end just before you do the binding. I had a few scraps left over after I was done, and you know, in theory, you think someday I'm really going to use it all up, and it's really, really hard to do. But I thought, okay, throw them on the back. So I pieced the back, I took the chunks that were left, and I came really close to using it all up. But these are some of the remnants from the front. Then I have a Christmas one here. And these are traditional blocks. Here's my block. It's basically half light, half dark. It's like a half square triangle. It's similar to the log cabin. The dark side is all scrappy pieces. It's all Christmas fabric. And the light side, and I have from white down to a pretty decent beige. But you can read this as light. You read this as dark. These are pretty dark. These are pretty light. But they all work together. So I made a bunch of blocks, and then I just randomly put them on the wall till I came up with a design that I liked. And then at the end, again, I wanted to try to use it all up. So I just pieced whatever I had, didn't matter. You can see here I got a whole bunch of pieces on this strip. Here I have a funky 9-patch, and I just threw it together and pieced it till it was big enough to be the back. I have a series that I call my second time around series. These 2 quilts are completely made out of binding scraps with a background. What I did was pulled a whole bunch of binding. When I say binding scraps, that means that it's pieces. They're usually, for me, 2 1/4 inch, sometimes 2 1/2, occasionally 2 inches. But they've been folded together, wrong sides together, and there might be multiple pieces still connected. So I went to my scrap section, stash, where I had my binding scraps, pulled out all this stuff, and I arbitrarily sorted them by brights and by not so bright, or more traditional and a little more fun. With this one, I took my strips, I sewed them together, and I didn't even stop to think too much about if they were 2 1/2 or 2 1/4. I just sewed them all together. And then I sliced them where I had ironed it where the fold was. So if they started out at, say, 2 1/4, they were closer to 1 inch by the time I'd sliced the fold off. And then I did go out and buy my background. And I purposely cut strips, but they're not all the same width, just for a little more eye appeal. So I would alternate with a background piece and then one of my sewed pieces. Background sewed, till it got big enough. And I just decided, okay, this is the size I want. This is as long as we want. This is the size we want. And then when I went to quilt it, I thought, all right, what would be fun to quilt it with? So I took this fold that I had cut off all of them, and I decided I'm going to lay that on randomly, and then I used a zigzag stitch and I just zigzagged that on, and that's how I quilted it. So that's with my traditional binding. So this is the second time around. Then I went to the second time around perennial garden. And with all the bright ones, I decided to ruffle them and think about flowers. So I sewed them together into long strips, and then I ran 2 basting strips and stitches. And basting stitches are the longest stitch on your machine. And whenever you ruffle something, you're always supposed to use 2 rows of stitching, because when you pull it to gather it, something's always going to break. So I'm gathering and pulling, and I think, okay, it doesn't even matter if it's a tight gather, a loose gather, I'll do whatever happens. And occasionally a couple of threads would break, and that's how the flowers started. Because when I started, I didn't quite have this all figured out. So some of these are just the end that kind of went limp after they broke off. And then after a while, I consciously started not minding if some of those broke off. And then I started kind of thinking about the flowers. And then I decided, okay, let's make every flower just a little bit different. So we have our bright strips, and again, I bought the background, and this time I chose a gray. And I cut different background strips, and again, they're different widths. I have the wider ones in the middle, and then it goes slightly narrower out to the sides. So I would do a strip of gray, sew on a strip of ruffle, gray, ruffle, till it was the size I wanted. Then I started making some of these little flowers. And like this one is just one piece, and I just pulled it around and futzed with it till I thought it looked fine. And then I reached underneath and stitched it down as best I could. But I left them all kind of loose. With this one, when it got done, I saw all this thread in the middle, and I thought, that's really ugly. So I got a little piece of rickrack and I sewed it on, and I still saw too much of an ugly center. So I took this little tiny scrap off of that one, folded it, and made it look like the center of the flower, and stuck it on. And again, I picked them up and sewed them down underneath so that the flowers are all loose. I went to my rickrack scraps, and I found enough different pieces, different colors, different widths of rickrack that I thought they made the perfect stems. And then as a final touch, I scrapped the binding, because I still had binding left. So this is all from binding, and this is binding used as binding once again. Now for my ultimate scrap one. I had gone to a talk once on making fabric out of a foundation and then chunks of stuff. You had a foundation piece, and then you cut chunks of fabric, and then you cut smaller chunks of fabric, smaller chunks of fabric, smaller, until the lady that was demonstrating took spools of thread and was snipping thread and laying it all over. Well, I went home, and I had spent all afternoon trimming blocks on one of my scrap quilts. And I hate to admit it, but I looked in my wastebasket, and I saw all this wonderful thread, and I thought, why would I cut a new spool of thread when I have all this fabulous stuff here? So the long and short of it is I started making evening bags, and I would start with a black background and put chunks of fabric on and then go slightly smaller. Eventually I went out and bought fancy yarn that had a little bit fringe with it. Here I have some chunks of ribbon, and I got tulle, florist tulle that had sparkle in it. So you have your foundation laid out, you have all these pieces sprinkled on, you lay the tulle over the top, and then just meander quilt it down to hold it together. Pop on some handles, and you have a very nice bag out of literally the dregs of the scraps. Happy quilting from Millhouse Quilts.